The Varith Council had been arguing for 11 days. 11 days of translated voices bouncing through the crystalline chamber of Station Orin 7, a place built by 6 civilizations over 400 years, a place that was supposed to represent the highest achievement of cooperative survival. The walls were carved from compressed asteroid material, layered with bioluminescent moss that the Feluan had cultivated specifically to calm negotiators during difficult sessions. The moss wasn't working anymore. It hadn't worked since the Dreth arrived. Nobody had ever seen the Dreth before. Not really. There were old sensor logs from the Margin War, grainy and disputed, showing something massive moving through the debris fields of the Crestian system. There were survivor accounts from Pelion Station, 4 survivors out of 9,000, who described lights that moved like water and sounds that felt like memory being pulled out through your teeth. But nobody had mapped them. Nobody had cataloged their biology, language, or intentions. What the Varith Council knew, after 11 days, was simple. The Dreth had taken Crestian again. Then Yulm. Then there are the 3 agricultural moons of Pallor, which fed 60 million Feluan civilians. They moved without declaration, without communication, and without any signal that translated into anything meaningful. The Varith's best linguistic analysts, a Feluan named Sorval who had decoded 4 dead languages and a Toon collective that processed information in parallel streams, had spent 9 days pointed at Dreth transmissions and come back with nothing. Not scrambled signals. Not encrypted data. There was no evidence of intentional communication whatsoever. "They don't negotiate," said Admiral Thessaly Orin, the Varith's senior military coordinator, a tall woman with close-cropped silver hair and a voice like a door closing. She stood at the center of the chamber's projection platform, and around her, the holographic display showed every contested system in red. There was a lot of red. "We've tried 17 contact protocols. We've broadcast on every frequency their ships have emitted. We've sent unmanned vessels loaded with universal mathematical sequences. The vessels were destroyed without deviation from their patrol routes. They didn't even slow down." Counselor Vreth of the Toon Collective, or rather, the physical representative of the Toon Collective, a body that housed 11 distinct minds operating in rotation, raised 4 of its 6 limbs in the gesture that meant we have considered this from multiple angles, and the conclusion is unpleasant. The Varith Alliance has lost 14 fleet divisions in 8 months. At the current trajectory, Dreth expansion reaches the core systems in 16 months. We are gathered here to discuss the emergency clause. Nobody said anything for a moment. The emergency clause. Thessaly had read it once, years ago, when she was studying Alliance history as a young tactical officer. It was buried in the original founding documents, written in the old Feluan script, and it had only been invoked once in 400 years, during the Margin War. The clause allowed the Alliance to formally request intervention from a civilization outside the Varith framework, a civilization that operated under different rules, different physics of conflict, and different assumptions about what war was supposed to look like. "We're actually discussing this," said Counselor Maeve II, the Feluan representative, her bioluminescent skin cycling through pale yellows that indicated deep distress. "We're actually sitting here. We've lost 9 billion people in 8 months, Thessaly said. "Yes. We're discussing this." The emergency clause named only one civilization per category. It didn't use a proper name. The original authors hadn't known one. It described them by their behavior, reputation, and the scattered accounts that had drifted in from systems beyond the Alliance's original mapping range. The original text read, in loose translation, "The ones who treat war as a craft. These are the ones whose ships carry the memories of every battle they have ever lost. They fight not according to the flow of water, but according to the decisions made by the stone." Everyone in the chamber knew who that meant. The humans. Thessaly had met 3 humans in her career. One was a diplomat named Carson who wore the same brown jacket every day for a year and had somehow negotiated a resource-sharing treaty that 6 Alliance economists had called impossible. One was an engineer named Priya, who had come to Station Orin 7 to consult on the antimatter containment systems and had spent her first 6 hours not touching anything, just walking around and looking before sitting down and rewriting 3 foundational equations that had been considered settled science. The third was a soldier. She'd never learned his name, who had passed through the station during a supply run, a quiet man who spent his off hours reading and who had once, in the observation lounge, looked at a sensor map of the Margin War's old battlefields and said something that had stayed with Thessaly for years. Whoever fought here, he'd said, was trying to win. That's not the same thing as trying to end it. She hadn't understood it then. She thought she was beginning to now. Send the signal, she said. The human response came in 4 days. Not a message. Not a confirmation. The diplomatic channel did not open with a carefully worded interest in the Alliance's situation. 4 days after Thessaly authorized the emergency signal, long-range sensors at the edge of the Polar system registered gravitational distortion, the specific, unmistakable signature of ships dropping out of faster-than-light transit simultaneously. Not one ship. Not a squadron. 47 vessels materialized in a formation so precise that the Veritas sensor arrays initially misread them as a single structure. Sorval, the linguist, was in the observation deck when it happened, and he later told Thessaly that his first thought wasn't fear or relief. His first thought was that the formation looked like a sentence, like something with syntax. Each ship was positioned relative to the others in a way that suggested relationship, hierarchy, and intention, as if the fleet itself was a statement that could be read if you knew the grammar. He spent 4 hours trying to decode it before he realized it wasn't a message for him. The fleet held position at the edge of the system for 6 hours. During those 6 hours, one ship detached from the formation, a vessel roughly a third the size of the others, clean-lined and fast, and moved towards Station Orin 7. It docked with a precision that made the station's automated systems register an error because no docking had actually been requested. The ship had simply found the right port and connected, like a key that knew the lock. Thessaly was in the docking bay when the humans came through. There were 5 of them. She'd expected uniforms like the Alliance used, rank indicators, species-coded color systems, and the visual language of organized military. What she got instead was a group of people in dark, practical clothing with no visible insignia at all, led by a woman who looked like she'd slept 4 hours in the last 2 days and considered that adequate. The woman's name was Commander Nora Vance. She was somewhere in her late 40s, with brown skin and dark eyes that moved constantly, not nervously, but methodically, the way a person's eyes move when they're building a map of a room from scratch. She shook Thessaly's hand. The humans had been briefed on Verith contact customs, and her grip was brief and firm and entirely unsentimental. Admiral Orin, she said, we've reviewed the sensor packages you transmitted. Before we discuss operational frameworks, I have 2 questions. Thessaly gestured for her to continue. First, the Dreth. Your analysts concluded their transmissions contain no intentional communication. I want to know what methodology they used to reach that conclusion, and I want to speak with the analysts directly. Thessaly nodded. And the second question? Vance looked at her steadily. Who in your command structure has the authority to tell us to stop? The question landed in the room, like something with weight. Thessaly noticed that Vance's people, the 4 officers behind her, didn't react to it. This implied that they had previously heard her ask the same question. This implied that their response was expected. This told her something about how humans thought about this kind of work that no briefing document had quite captured. They often relied on prior experiences and established norms to guide their understanding and expectations. Thessaly stated, in the end, it's up to the Council. Operationally, you'd be coordinating with me. Then I need you to understand something clearly before we go any further, Vance said. We're not here to save you. We're not here to demonstrate anything. We were called because you have a problem that has a specific shape and we have experience with that shape. What we do, how we do it is going to look wrong to you at points. It's going to feel wrong. I need to know you can hold steady through that feeling and keep the communication channel between us open because the moment that channel closes is the moment things go badly for everyone. Thessaly studied her. You've done this before. Been called in. 3 times, Vance said. Once we were stopped before we finished. The situation we left behind was worse than the one we found. What happened? The council that stopped us decided our methods were philosophically incompatible with their values. She said it without bitterness, without judgment. Just a fact. They were right. They were also not wrong to stop us. And the Great Expansion killed 400 million people in the following year.
She paused.
I'm not saying these words to frighten you. I'm telling you because you deserve to understand the full shape of what you're asking for. Thessaly had commanded fleets. She had sent people into battles they didn't return from. She had made decisions with information she knew was incomplete, in time frames that didn't allow for the luxury of certainty, which often led to devastating consequences for her fleets and the lives of those she commanded, such as significant losses in battles and diminished morale among her troops. She understood, deep within her own architecture, what Vance was actually saying, beyond rank and responsibility. You called us. Own that. I can hold steady, Thessaly said. Vance nodded once. Then show me to Sorval. Sorval had not slept properly in 3 weeks. His workspace looked like the inside of a mind that had stopped organizing itself. Data streams on every surface, acoustic models of Dreth transmissions printed on physical paper because he processed certain patterns better when he could hold them, 17 empty beverage containers, and a small potted plant that his assistant kept watering despite his complete indifference to it. He expected the human commander to react to the disorder. Most visitors did. The Toon Collective's representative had spent an entire meeting clearly distressed by it. Vance walked in, looked at the space for about 3 seconds, and then walked directly to the acoustic model printouts on the left wall and stood in front of them with her hands clasped behind her back. These are the transmission samples? She asked.
Yes.
The samples were collected over a period of 8 months. 17 distinct frequency bands. Sorval moved to stand beside her. Up close, she smelled like recycled ship air and something that might have been coffee. He'd read about that. My conclusion was that there is no intentional signal structure. There were no patterns of repetition that were consistent with language. No mathematical encoding I could identify. I used 14 different analytical frameworks. What were you listening for? Vance asked. Sorval paused. It was an unexpected question. Communication. Information transfer. Signal embedded in carrier. Vance tilted her head slightly, looking at the acoustic model. We have a concept, very old, from our military history. Pressure communication. It's not language in the sense of symbolic encoding. It's the deliberate use of action to transmit states. You don't send a message saying, "We are powerful." You move your forces in a way that makes the opponent feel that power. The message is in the physical arrangement of force.
She paused.
Your analysts were looking for their transmissions to contain communication. What if their movements are the communication? Sorval stood very still. He had 14 analytical frameworks. None of them had been applied to the movement patterns of Dreth vessels, which could offer clues about their communicative intent and strategic maneuvers, despite the potential insights that could be gained from understanding how these movements relate to their overall behavior and tactics. He had been treating the transmissions as the signal. He had been treating the movements as military action, separate from any communicative intent. If movement is the message, he said slowly, then the destruction of our vessels was an aggression.
It was.
A sentence, Vance said. Maybe.
I don't know yet.
That's why I asked to speak with you directly. She turned from the wall. I need everything you have on their movement patterns. I require information on formation changes, velocity adjustments, and the geometry of their positioning prior to each engagement. And I need you to reframe your question. Don't ask what they're saying. Ask what they're doing, and then ask what a being would need to believe to consider that action coherent. Sorval looked at her. You've encountered something like this before. Something adjacent. She said it carefully, and he noticed the care. Different physiology, different context. But the principle has come up that a civilization might communicate in a register so different from yours that you can only hear it if you change what you're listening with. He was quiet for a moment. The small potted plant sat on his desk, absolutely indifferent to all of this. If they are communicating, he said, and we have been responding to their communications as if they were unprovoked attacks, then the situation has a different shape than everyone thinks, Van said. Yes. That doesn't change what they've done. 9 billion people. No, she said. It doesn't change that. It might change what comes next. She looked at him directly. I have 47 ships sitting at the edge of your system. I have the capability to end the Dreth presence in your space. Whether I should, and how, and what the consequences of each option look like. That's why I'm standing in your office asking about acoustic models instead of giving orders. She picked up one of the empty beverage containers absently, looked at it, and set it down. Analyze the movement data. Tell me what you find. We have, I'd estimate, about 9 days before the Dreth make their next advance, based on their pattern interval. Sorval turned back to his wall of data. His mind was already restructuring around the new framework, the way a sentence changes meaning when you move the emphasis. What is coherent action for a being like this? What does the world have to look like from inside the Dreth for their behavior to make sense? He reached for a clean sheet of paper. He stayed awake for another 36 hours, but this time it was because something was happening. On the third day of Sorval's new analysis, Commander Vance returned to Station Orin, 7 from the fleet, for a meeting that wasn't on any official schedule. She brought one of her officers, a younger man named Lieutenant Daniel Cho, who carried a datapad and said almost nothing but whose presence seemed to have a specific function Thessaly couldn't quite identify. Vance sat across from Thessaly in the Admiral's office, and for the first time since her arrival, she didn't look entirely composed. Sorval's preliminary findings, she said, sliding a data chip across the table. He transmitted them an hour ago. I want to walk through them with you before we take them to the Council. Thessaly loaded the chip. The display built itself on the surface of the desk, a three-dimensional reconstruction of Dreth fleet movements over 8 months, color-coded by velocity and geometry, with Sorval's annotations layered over everything in his small, dense script. Caro, Vance said, an old navigational term in some human dialects, meaning look here, this is the point of the display at the first major engagement. See the angle of approach? The Dreth fleet didn't come in on the optimal attack vector. They came in at exactly 47 degrees off the optimum point of engagement. Same offset. Thessaly looked. She'd seen the engagement logs. She hadn't noticed the angle consistency. What does that mean? Sorval's interpretation, and I think he's right, is that it's a posture, not aggressive. This stance bears a resemblance to the behavior of certain animal species when they venture into unfamiliar territory. They come in off-angle because a direct approach in their behavioral framework means something they're not doing. Vance leaned forward. They're not attacking with full intent. They're probing. They are advancing into space and observing any resistance they encounter. They've destroyed 14 fleet divisions. They've killed 9 billion people.
Yes.
And the thing that Sorval found, the thing that I've been sitting with for the last 3 hours trying to decide how to tell you, is that the Dreth have a specific response to what they appear to classify as genuine resistance. Vance pulled up a subsection of the display. The display highlighted 3 incidents in green. These were the 3 engagements where Alliance forces held formation under sustained fire instead of retreating or being destroyed. In each case, the Dreth disengaged.
Completely.
Left the system. Thessaly looked at the 3 flagged incidents. She knew them. They were considered Pyrrhic defensive actions. Alliance forces had held only because they were surrounded and couldn't retreat, and the casualty rates had been catastrophic. You're saying they were testing for something. Sorval thinks they're looking for what they classify as a Pyr, another civilization that responds to pressure with coherent resistance rather than dissolution. That's their communication question, not do you have, but do you hold? It's a completely different epistemology of contact. Vance sat back. They may not understand peace negotiations as we do. They may have a concept of recognition, 2 forces pressing against each other until both know the other is real. The silence in the office was very heavy. That's a philosophy that has killed 9 billion people, Thessaly said quietly. Yes. And if it's true, she stopped. Reorganized. If the report is accurate, then what you're about to tell me is that bringing 47 human warships into the Warzone might not end the Dreth threat. It might confirm that we're worth the war they're trying to find. Vance looked at her. You got there faster than I expected. I've been commanding fleets for 20 years, Thessaly said. I know what it looks like when a solution creates the next problem. She looked at the display. So, why are you here? What is it that you can do that makes the calculations still work in our favor? Vance was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because we've been where the Dreth are." Not recently. The incident was a significant event in our history. We rarely discuss this period in diplomatic contexts. She met Thessaly's eyes. Humans used to make war the way the Dreth do. The Dreth do not wage war for territory or resources. They fought for the validation of their existence. We seek an answer to the question of our significance in the structure of the universe. She paused. We're not doing that anymore. We found other questions. And we remember very specifically what it took to change. You think you can communicate with them? I think we might be the only civilization in your alliance's contact range that has a chance of speaking in a register they can hear, Vance said. But it requires something that is going to be very difficult to approve at the council level.
Tell me.
We have to go in first, alone, not as protectors. We are not arranged in a way that indicates support from the alliance. She looked at the display. We go in as ourselves. There are 47 ships present, no diplomatic cover, and no retreat corridor. We press into their space, off-angle, the way they come in. We let them read us. And then, and this is the part that has no precedent, we stop. You stop. We hold a position in their space, but we do nothing. We remain in place and do not respond to their probing. We demonstrate in the only language they might understand that we know how to hold without needing the engagement to resolve. She sat back. We have to show them that we've been where they are, and we're not there anymore. Thessaly sat with her thoughts for a long time. Outside the office viewport, the stars were static and indifferent. Somewhere in the Pallor system, 60 million Feluan civilians were eating food from emergency reserves because their agricultural moons were occupied. At the edge of the sensor range, 47 human warships sat in formation, akin to a sentence awaiting interpretation. And if it doesn't work, she said, then I have 47 warships and the capacity to do what you originally called us to do. Vance's voice was completely level. HFY from that point, I'll do what needs doing. But I'd like to try the other thing first. The Pallor system looked like a wound. Vance watched it resolve on the main display as the fleet dropped out of transit, and the word came to her without drama, just observation, the way a doctor looks at an X-ray and names what they see. The agricultural moons were visible in their orbits, but the bioluminescent surface patterns, which were a result of Feluan terraforming, had now dimmed, as their automated systems were apparently disrupted by whatever the Dreth did to the infrastructure when they settled into occupied space, leading to a significant decline in agricultural productivity and threatening the livelihoods of the inhabitants on those moons. The Dreth was there. They didn't try to be invisible. Vance had expected something that looked threatening. What the sensors showed her was something that looked like weather, vast, organized, and operating on a scale that made threats seem like too small a category. 43 Dreth vessels were lined up in a way that Sorval's new framework recognized as a way to observe, spread out across the system in all directions, facing the spot where the human fleet had come in. They'd been watching for incoming. They'd seen the humans arrive. All stations hold current velocity, Vance said. No targeting systems active. I want our emissions profile to resemble that of survey vessels. Passive only. Lieutenant Cho looked up from his station. They're already moving to acknowledge us, Commander. Formation shift in progress. See the inner 3 vessels rotating? Sorval's model identifies that as their orientation to address posture. They see us, Vance said. Good. Let them look. She had 47 ships. She had crews that had trained for this specific kind of operation, not combat in the traditional sense, but what the human military privately called presence operations, the deployment of force as a form of language. It was an old discipline. It required a tolerance for ambiguity that some commanders could not sustain, and the ability to sit in the middle of something that could become catastrophic in seconds and simply remain. She'd screened for that tolerance specifically when assembling this crew. The psychological profiles had taken 3 months. Some of the best tactical officers in the fleet hadn't made the cut. It was philosophical. Take us in, she said. Same angle offset as Sorval identified. 47 degrees off direct approach. Match velocity to their formation drift. The fleet moved, and the Dreth watched. For 2 hours, Vance's fleet moved through the Polar system at observation velocity, off-angle, passive, and visible. The Dreth formation shifted twice, not to intercept, but to maintain optimal observational geometry, the way an audience turns to follow a performer across a stage. Cho was tracking the movements in real time against Sorval's model, and every 20 minutes he sent a quiet update. Model consistent, no aggression indicators, probe posture maintained. Then, 3 hours in, one of the inner Dreth vessels broke from the formation and moved toward them. "It's doing the 47-degree offset," Cho said, and his voice was very careful, the voice of a person trying not to color a reading with emotion. "It precisely matches the geometry of our approach," Cho said. "Commander, it's mirroring us." Vance felt something shift in her chest. It wasn't fear, as she had already transformed fear into a more functional emotion long ago. This feeling was recognition. This was the unique feeling of witnessing a moment transform into what you had hoped it could be.
"Hold our course," she said.
Hold everything. The Dreth vessel came to within 1,200 kilometers of the fleet's lead ship and stopped. It was massive up close, twice the size of Vance's flagship. Its surface not metal in any conventional sense, but something that seemed to absorb sensor readings and return them slightly altered, like a conversation that paraphrases rather than quotes. Its shape suggested internal logic rather than external design, the way a living thing looks different from a machine even when you can't point to a specific feature. "They're transmitting," Cho said. "Put it on the acoustic array. Don't filter it." The sound filled the bridge, not quite sound, processed into audio range for human perception, but something that carried the quality of intent even before analysis. It moved through registers that Sorval's framework had mapped as inquiry. It was, in structure, a question. Vance looked at the Dreth vessel on the main display for a long moment. Then she said, "Transmit our fleet's formation data."
"Just that."
"The data should include our positions, velocities, and geometry. No message. Just show them our shape." Cho looked at her. "If their question is, 'What are you?'" she said, "then the answer is our formation. Let them read it." He transmitted. The Dreth vessel was silent for 11 minutes. Then it shifted a small movement, a rotation of maybe 5 degrees, that Sorval's model flagged with an annotation that read, "Acknowledging as peer class." "Commander," Cho said quietly, "I think we're having a conversation." The conversation took 4 days. It wasn't conversation in any form that would have been recognizable without Sorval's evolving framework. It was movement and formation, and the deliberate geometry of force arranged and rearranged in the space between two fleets, each side reading the other's arrangements the way you read a face rather than a text. Vance spent those 4 days in cycles of 6 hours at the display and 2 hours sleeping, eating meals at her station, and speaking, and when she did, it was precisely. On the 3rd day, Sorval transmitted an update from Station Orin 7 that changed the interpretation of everything. The Dreth formation, he'd realized, had a historical dimension. Their arrangements weren't just present-tense statements. They were accretive, built from layers of previous configurations that a sufficiently perceptive observer could read backward, like geological strata. The Dreth weren't just showing their current state. They were revealing their past, and within that past lay a mystery that halted Sorval's analysis for a full 6 hours before he could resume. The Dreth had encountered another spacefaring civilization before. A long time ago, Sorval estimated 3,000 years, given the depth of the historical layer. That civilization had responded to Dreth's probing pressure with catastrophic counterforce, not a language of resistance, but an attempt at annihilation. The Dreth had survived. The other civilization had not. And the pattern of Dreth's behavior since, the specific off-angle approach, the probing, the destruction of everything that collapsed under pressure, the disengagement from the 3 alliance forces that it held, it was all downstream of that encounter. For 3,000 years, they had sought confirmation that they had preserved the only other mind worth finding. That was what Sorval's message said, in his small dense script, at 0300 hours on the 3rd day. Vance read it twice. Then she sat in her command chair for a while in the dark, with the display showing the Dreth fleet holding position 600 kilometers away, and she thought about the weight of 3,000 years of loneliness structured as aggression. She thought about what it does to a civilization to win a war they didn't want to be the last survivors of. She thought about what a species looks like when it's been asking the same question for millennia and never getting an answer that holds. Are you real? Can you hold? She thought about human history. She contemplated the brief periods of human history that were often omitted from diplomatic briefings and discussions. She pondered the lengthy centuries during which humanity had been engaged in activities similar to those of the Dreth, albeit not exactly the same, but sharing a structural quality, a violence that was more about confirmation than acquisition. She'd studied it not in the sanitized version taught to cadets, but in the primary sources, the accounts of people inside it, and what had always struck her was how invisible the underlying question was to the people living it. They would have described their motivations in resource, territorial, and ideological terms, and beneath all those articulate justifications was something wordless and enormous that needed to be acknowledged. She understood the Dreth. That was the thing she hadn't said to Thessaly, because it required more trust than 4 days of acquaintance could build. She didn't just have a tactical read on them. She understood them in a way that went somewhere deeper than strategy, and that understanding was both the reason she was the right person to be here and the most dangerous thing about her being here, as it meant she could anticipate their moves and motivations more accurately than anyone else. Because you can understand something and still have to stop it, especially when that understanding reveals the potential for significant harm or disruption. On the 4th day, she made a decision. She called Cho to her station and gave him a specific transmission to prepare, not formation data, not geometric communication, but something Sorval had flagged as theoretically possible, a temporal sequence, a before and after. The human fleet's current formation, followed by a demonstration of its potential, active weapons, targeting systems online, and full combat configuration, lasted exactly 30 seconds before returning to a passive survey posture. We could. We choose not to. Cho looked at her. This is either going to work, or it's going to start the war we came here to prevent. Yes, she said. You're sure?
No, she said.
Transmit it. The Dreth fleet went completely still. Every vessel, all 43 of them, ceased its formation drift simultaneously. Vance had never seen them static before. It was like watching a river stop. Then, 17 minutes later, the Dreth did something that neither Sorval's model nor anyone's preparation had anticipated. They showed their history. Their communication did not follow the temporal sequence format that Vance had used. In formation, they produced something that the analysis later described as a confession, using the layered accretive geometry that Sorval had identified as historical depth. They demonstrated the 3,000-year-old engagement, the destroyed civilization, and the structure of that destruction. They made it visible in their arrangement of force and space. They held it there for 4 hours while Vance's fleet watched, and the only interpretation that Sorval's framework offered was witness this. They're showing us what they did, Cho said quietly. Yes. Why? Vance watched the display. The Dreth vessels held their configuration, 43 ships arranged in a geometry that encoded loss, that was built from the shape of something that couldn't be undone and hadn't been forgotten for 3,000 years. Because we showed them we could have done it, she said. And then we stopped. And that's the first time in 3,000 years that anything outside themselves has answered their question in a way that included the possibility of restraint.
She paused.
They're not confessing to us. They're showing us that they know the shape of the thing they've been doing. They are demonstrating their ability to perceive it. Is that enough? Cho asked. She didn't answer immediately. The honest answer was she didn't know. Understanding, even genuine understanding, even the kind that arrived after 3,000 years of searching and expressed itself as a civilization laying its worst act out in the open space between 2 fleets, understanding wasn't a treaty. It wasn't 9 billion lives returned. It was not the agricultural moons of Pallor that were restored. What had happened here in this system, over 4 days of geometric communication between a human fleet and a civilization that had never successfully talked to anyone, was real, important, and only a beginning. And beginnings were not the same as resolutions. Transmit to Orin 7, she said. I need to speak with Sorval and Admiral Orin. Audio only. She stood from her command chair. And I need someone to bring me something to eat. Whatever we have. I don't care. Cho almost smiled. You want a sandwich, despite the galaxy-altering first contact situation. I want whatever we have, she said. I've been awake for 26 hours. The galaxy can wait 20 minutes. The council session was the longest in the station's 400-year history. 22 hours. 2 recesses. At one point, Counselor Mavesecon's bioluminescent skin cycled into a color that Feluan biologists later identified as only the 3rd confirmed instance of grief rage visible in their species' recorded history. Thessaly sat through all of it. Vance attended remotely from her ship, her voice coming through the chamber's acoustic system with a slight compression of long-range transmission. She answered questions for 9 hours. She was patient with questions she'd already answered. She was precise when precision was needed, and she was honest when honesty meant saying, I don't know. When Counselor Vreth of the Tuun Collective asked whether the Dreth communication represented a genuine change of intent or a tactical recalibration designed to neutralize the human fleet before returning to expansion, she sat with the question for a long moment and said, I can't give you certainty on that. What I can tell you is that in the 400-year history of the emergency clause, every civilization that has ever been called and has fulfilled the original intent of that clause has had to give you the same answer. Certainty is not available. The Dreth showed us something that cost them something to show. Whether that's the beginning of a different relationship or a sophisticated manipulation, we'll know in the behavior that follows, not in anything I can prove to you in this room. What she could prove, the Dreth had not advanced in the 10 days since the human fleet entered the Polar system. What she could show, Sorval's movement analysis, which demonstrated behavioral changes in the Dreth formation consistent with what is model classified as a suspended inquiry state. They were waiting. What she could offer, a proposed framework for the next phase, which was neither military nor exactly diplomatic in any conventional sense. HFY, a phrase Vance used, explaining it as an old human expression meaning roughly, from this point, this is what I carry, she said. From this point, what I carry is the knowledge that this is possible. She acknowledged the existence of a language that could bridge the gap. What the Alliance carries is the decision about whether to use it. The Council voted to 6 in favor of the framework. It wasn't unanimous. The 6 who voted against weren't wrong. They were carrying 9 billion dead and 14 fleet divisions and 60 million Feluan civilians eating emergency rations, and they looked at the proposition that the Dreth were worth trying to understand rather than simply remove, and they said, this is a philosophy that presupposes we can afford to get it wrong. That position was coherent. It was not something Thessaly could dismiss as cowardice or ignorance. It was a different calculation made by people who had measured the cost already. She voted with the majority. She would carry her reasons the way you carry any decision made under uncertainty, not comfortably, not with the confidence of hindsight, but with the full awareness that she had chosen, and the choice had a shape that would unfold over time. After the session, she sat alone in the chamber for a while. The bioluminescent moss on the walls had resumed its calm, cycling pattern. Whoever had cultivated it had understood something about how minds work, that even the body's peripheral perception of calm can hold a thinking creature together when the thought itself becomes too large to be comfortable. She sat in the moss light and let herself feel the full weight of what had happened, not the version she'd perform for future briefings and historical records, but the actual texture of it, the parts that didn't resolve into clean conclusions. 9 billion people. A civilization of 47 ships sat in a contested system, conversing with 43 ships that had spent 3,000 years trying to find something worth finding. The Dreth showed their worst act to strangers in the dark between stars, and the strangers looked on. The gap between understanding and justice was real and did not close simply because it was named. She sat with all of it. That was, she'd found, the only honest relationship you could have with a decision of this scale. Not resolution. Sustained attention. 6 months later, Sorval published the first comprehensive framework for Dreth Alliance communication. It was 400 pages long and included a theoretical foundation, a practical lexicon of geometric and movement-based expressions, a historical analysis of the Dreth's 3,000-year expansion period read through the new interpretive lens, and an appendix that Sorval had titled simply, what we were listening for, and what we should have been listening for. That appendix, 16 pages of dense analytical prose, was later taught in every Verith diplomatic academy as a foundational text not about the Dreth specifically, but about the category of error it represented, the assumption that communication must arrive in a form you already recognize. The Dreth did not withdraw from the Pallor system immediately. They left the Pallor system gradually over 4 months, following a plan that Sorvel's framework described as a careful withdrawal. Each step seemed to be based on an internal Dreth process of adjustment rather than responding to pressure from the Alliance. They left the agricultural moons. The Feluan terraforming systems came back online slowly and inconsistently, requiring 18 months of repair work, which delayed the restoration of agricultural production and exacerbated the food scarcity crisis faced by the population. 60 million civilians did not starve, but they went hungry in ways that left long shadows, such as through malnutrition and the psychological effects of food scarcity on their communities. 9 billion dead remained 9 billion dead. That number did not change. It would not change. It was carried by those who carried it, and it would be carried forward in the way such numbers always are, into the choices made by people who had not been there, who would have to decide how much weight to give it when the Dreth appeared in their political conversations as something other than an enemy. Vance returned to the station twice in those 6 months. On her first visit, she was briefed for a technical debrief. The second time, she came alone, without her officers, and spent 3 days doing something that wasn't on any official agenda, which raised questions about her true intentions and what she was really seeking during her time at the station. Thessaly found her on the observation deck on the second evening, the long, curved room that looked out at the stars from the station's far side, where the light from the Pallor system's sun came in soft and warm and made the asteroid stone walls look almost welcoming. "You didn't have to come back," Thessaly said. "You know what the hardest part of that kind of work is? It's the part nobody briefs you on." Thessaly stood beside her. "What?" "Afterward, you understand something you didn't understand before," Vance said. "And the understanding is real, and it matters, and it changes how you see certain things. And it doesn't fix what happened. It just exists alongside it. You must see if you can. You know what the hardest part of that kind of work is? It's the part nobody briefs you on." "Of that kind of work?" "It's the part nobody briefs you on." "Of that kind of work?" "It's the part nobody briefs you on." "Of that kind of work?" "It's the part nobody briefs you on," and the unfixability, without resolving one into the other. She glanced at Thessaly. "Some people can't. They turn the understanding into forgiveness before it's earned, because the weight of holding both is too much. Or they refuse the understanding because accepting it feels like betraying what was lost." Thessaly looked at the stars. "And you?" "I'm still finding out," Vance said. "That's what this trip is for, honestly. I'm here to stand in this room and look at the system and see if I can hold both." They stood there in silence for a while. The moss on the walls, someone had thought to cultivate it in the observation deck too, which Thessaly hadn't noticed before, cycled through its slow, calm pattern. The light of Pallor's sun came through the viewport. Somewhere in the system, Dreth vessels were doing whatever Dreth vessels did in a period Sorvel's framework classified as recalibration, which was a word that carried enormous uncertainty compressed into a tidy package, often involving adjustments to their navigation systems and resource allocations to ensure optimal performance during their missions. Somewhere on one of the agricultural moons, Feluan engineers were fixing the terraforming systems one component at a time, the slow, unglamorous work of repair that followed every crisis, the work that history books abbreviated if they mentioned it at all. "I keep thinking about the 3,000-year question," Thessaly said quietly. "The one they were asking about with their formations. Are you real?
Can you hold?" She paused.
That's not so different from what any of us want to know. This is based on what the original builders of this station were asking when they put 6 civilizations in a room together. Vance glanced at her. "Whether there's anything else out there worth the effort of staying present for," Thessaly said. "Whether the effort of real contact is worth the risk of what contact can cost." "And what do you think?" Vance asked. Thessaly considered it honestly, as she had been learning to do since the day Vance walked through the docking bay and asked who had the authority to tell her to stop. I think the alternative, she said slowly, is 3,700 years of silence structured as violence until someone finally holds still long enough to change the question. She looked at the stars. That's a long time to wait. I'd rather start now and carry the uncertainty. Vance was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's the first time I've heard someone else say that out loud." The moss cycled. The light held. The stars were as they always were, huge, old, and indifferent to interpretation, which meant the interpretation was entirely up to whoever was standing in the room, looking out at them, deciding what the view was worth. It wasn't a resolution. It was a beginning that was different and harder, and the only kind of thing that ever actually lasted.
End.